Welcome back to the program. You have to ask yourself, after two devastating mass killings in New Zealand and Sri Lanka, are Christians in danger from copycat criminals across the globe? The U.S. imports products from around the world, but should drugs with the potential to kill be imported as well? And I want you to vote in our Twitter poll. You'll find it at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com, our website. Should American states let terrorists and other killers vote in elections? You can vote in the Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. It's always a pleasure to welcome back the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., Frank Gaffney. Frank, welcome back.
Thank you, Lars. It's good to be with you.
I want to ask you about Sri Lanka. Nearly 300 lives. In fact, the death toll could go higher. We don't know the final count. But Christians who were attacked because of their faith by the declared folks who did this are the Islamic State. And they now say, apparently, those claiming credit, say that they did it because of the attacks by one man on these mosques in New Zealand. What does this mean for Christians around the globe who are literally being killed by the thousands every year, maybe tens of thousands, depending on who you believe?
Oh, it's considerably more than that, I think, Lars, when you put it all together. What's happening to Christians around the world, and this recent incident of Easter in Sri Lanka is just the most recent and a particularly egregious example of it, is that the persecution of Christians is taking place on an epic scale. I mean, unique in history. And just to give you a sense of it, though this is not something that is widely reported, I'm sorry to say, but by some estimates, there are as many as 300 million Christians who are being heavily persecuted around the world just because of their faith. Mm-hmm. And when you think about that in an historical context, we talk a lot about the horrors of the Holocaust, for example, and what Pol Pot did in Cambodia, and what Joseph Stalin did in the Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union, and what Mao Zedong did in China. Well, Lars, if you put all together the number of people who lost their lives in that series of horrific acts of inhumanity, it pales by comparison to that number of Christians that they're having their lives destroyed. Fortunately, not all of them are being killed at the moment, but you can bet that their lives are being disrupted horrifically and even destroyed. So this is the crisis of our time, and the fact that we're not able to speak of it. For example, Barack Obama and Hillary, obviously reading off the talking points, that those Easter worshipers were killed, is evidence of the sanitizing that is allowing this kind of persecution to take place, basically with those responsible feeling they can do so with impunity.
Frank, it almost echoes the kind of language that the Iranians use, the mullahs use, when they come out and speak out against the Saturday people, the Jewish people, and the Sunday people, we Christians, because there's I don't know how to describe it, maybe a diminution, to use a word that's kind of familiar in Muslim circles, dimitude. You diminish your opponent by saying, the Saturday people. You don't call them Christians. You say some people did some things, the way Ilhan Omar did, and you say, those were Easter people who were Easter celebrants, instead of calling them Christians, because God forbid you should do that, even though just a short time ago, the media had no problem talking about the Muslims who were murdered in New Zealand. And that was wrong, but it's just as wrong to murder people because of their Christian faith. And yet the major media has bought into this kind of language and this kind of thinking.
Yeah. And it's more to do, it seems to me, Lars, with this Sharia blasphemy code that is restricting our speech. You're not allowed under Sharia, which, as you know, is this Islamic, brutally repressive, totalitarian doctrine that the Sharia supremacists seek to impose on all of us. And one of its principal features and sort of leading indicators is this notion that nobody can say anything that gives offense to Muslims or their faith. And pointing out that they're perpetrating these kinds of attacks has become, taboo in a lot of places. It's just not done. And I'm afraid that is simply reinforcing the confidence that these jihadists have that Allah is going to favor them with victory. And you don't want to have them getting that impression. That's for sure. They will behave even worse in the future against even more of us, I'm afraid.
Well, especially, Frank, because when you see even your opponents, the rest of the civilized world, who ought to be standing up and defending their members, by saying you cannot do this to these people. We have a pluralistic society. Every religion is allowed, and you're also allowed to practice no religion whatsoever. And your right to do that is given to you by God, but is protected by a constitution that the government has to follow. And yet when people within that system, even those in government, as you say, the former president, Obama, and Hillary Clinton, who buy into this kind of language, because they also do not want to, they don't want to offend Islam. In fact, you remember that when he was president, Obama did everything he could to kiss up to Islam. The future does not belong to those who disparage the name of the Prophet Muhammad. He never said anything like that about Christians, but he sure said it about his Muslim buddies. And that bothered all of us. His connection to and his seeming willingness to associate with terrorists like William Ayers and those folks. And I warned people when he ran. I said, this guy is way too cozy with terrorists. Well, as president, he was way too cozy with one particular religion and dismissive, those people who cling to their God and their guns and their Bibles. He was dismissive of the rest of us, and it goes on today.
Yeah. And again, it clears the way, I think, for people to believe that they can deal horrifically, brutally, violently against Christians with impunity, as I said. But, Lars, there's one other thing, as long as we're going down memory lane.
Sure.
An abiding legacy of that favoritism that Obama and his team, Hillary most especially, and Homa Abedin, remember her, exhibited towards, again, not Muslims because they're Muslims, but Muslims who actually embrace this idea that Sharia is the way and we all have to submit to it, Muslim as well as non-Muslim, by the way, is the tie-in that these guys had with the Muslim Brotherhood. And we've talked about this group a lot over the years, but the trouble is that most Americans don't have any idea what this group of Sharia supremacists, yes, but Muslims who are often in suits rather than, wearing traditional garb, often well-spoken, often very friendly, have done to insinuate their agenda, their infrastructure in our country, and do so in a way that I believe is tantamount to, what they call civilization jihad, a kind of stealthy operation that is every bit as dangerous in countries like ours as is the violent kind. So we've got to be alive to both of these and not emboldening them by making concessions that I'm afraid they read as submission.
I couldn't agree with you more. Frank Gaffney heads up and founded the Center for Security Policy.